Hello and welcome to Craftwork, a podcast by writers for writers.
Craftwork is recorded in Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, the people of the Wolastoq River. I'm Maryse Meijer.
And I'm Mike Thorne, we'll be your co-hosts. The music for this podcast is composed and recorded by Randy Nickel-Schroeder.
Maryse Meijer is the author of Heartbreaker, Rag, Northwood, and The Seventh Mansion. She lives in Chicago.
I've been a big fan of Maryse's work for several years now. A few years ago, our mutual contact, Kathe Koja, urged me to seek out her work. The first book I read of hers was The Seventh Mansion, which I adored, and I recently read Heartbreaker as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, Maryse. We're very excited to talk with you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Likewise.
To kick things off, I was really intrigued by a quote you had in your Volume 1 Brooklyn interview when you described yourself as a realist, not a fabulist. You said, quote, "If a character tells me something, I believe it. I think all my narrators are more or less reliable. When someone asks me if this or that thing really happened in a story, all I can say is, yeah, because obviously none of it really happened, but at the same time, it happened," unquote. This resonates with me, especially your reticence to embrace the distancing or genre-coded category of horror rather than the sort of affective or metaphysical experience of horror. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about your views on metaphor in fiction.
I think that still feels true for me now as a writer. I think there's a tendency to immediately go to interpretation when people are talking about things that they're reading or things that they're writing. We're all taught in high school to look for metaphors and to try to figure out what the author really meant by saying this or writing that. I don't plan, what I'm going to work on before I start writing. I don't make diagrams or outlines. It's really just about watching the people do the things at first, and then, of course, you try to figure out later how it all fits together. I see my role more as an observer, I guess, of my own work and not an interpreter of it. Other people are going to do that automatically. But I do think it's important to remind each other that even if the characters in a work aren't based on real people that you know or that you've met, and they're not based on yourself, they still represent real people and real experiences. I mean, obviously, if we're talking about genre things or things that are impossible to have happen in real life, that's one thing. But I think that the feelings and a lot of the circumstances still really exist somewhere or did at one time, right? And to remember that that's what I mean by realism. It's like this still represents things that essentially like people deal with or that they experience. And to jump immediately to people or instances in writing as being about something else is to forget that it's all rooted in a human experience or even a non-human experience. If we're writing about plants or animals, even though of course there's limitations to what we can know about the way that other things live and feel, we're still trying to represent something that is essentially not fiction, I think.
Speaking of metaphor, I guess to make it more granular, we're talking about it on a more broad level. I do find on a sentence level, your writing to be, it almost reminds me of imagism, like you're quite sparing with adjective, like it feels very sparse, but also very evocative and vivid. I do think that you have an impressive command of tone and atmosphere on the most atomic level. And I was reading an interview with you and Jennifer Solheim, in which you described yourself as someone who, quote, aggressively micromanages language, unquote. Does it take a lot of time for you to calibrate that fine balance? Do you obsess over sentences?
Yes. Yeah, I feel like the things I've been working on the past few years are a little bit less sparse, I guess, or less just purely observational. Yeah, the way something sounds is maybe the most important thing I think about when I'm revising, and that's the editing is the bulk of the work that I do. which is probably true for most writers. If I have to read something, for an event, I still edit. I'll still write in a book, like I'll change the sentences, even though obviously no one else is going to read it except for me at this point. I think that's true for a lot of writers. If you're forced to revisit stuff that you've done before, you're cringing at the choices that you made or didn't make or forgot to make or ran out of time to make. But yeah, I was talking to Dennis Cooper a few months ago. He's a real big influence for me and just a great friend and a great writer. And I was having trouble with a novel that I've been working on for a couple of years. It was because I couldn't figure out how it was supposed to sound. I knew what it was about, the story and the characters, but there's no voice in it at all. And it's just the writing is atrocious. And I said something like, well, maybe for this project, the way it sounds doesn't matter. And I remember his silence for a moment, like, no, that's the only thing that matters. And I was like, you're right. If we're talking about tone and atmosphere, the writing is the tool through which you control the effects of the work or the scene. I think we notice it so much more in film, maybe, because you can see it literally instead of relying on this mediation of language to control what the reader sees. And of course, you can't control that fully, but you can do your best to set the scene for them. And I think it's more important to me to create a feeling rather than a message. So if we're talking about metaphors and things like that, I'm not big on metaphors at all. As an editor, when I'm editing other people's writing, I always err on the side of asking people to take as much of that stuff out as possible and focus on the real thing. What's really happening? You don't need to create that other layer because it's already there, right? Our brains are already going to do that work of generating the metaphors, making connections between the real and the imaginary. So I think the less that we feel like we have to know about what we're writing, the better it is for us and for the reader, because then you're giving the reader a lot of room to think about why something's happening. And I don't feel like it's important for me to know why. I ran into a lot of trouble in my MFA because I, was interested in backstory and all of that stuff. Language is really important to me. When I was in high school and junior high, the two most important writers for me were Nabokov and Samuel Beckett, and two really different, two extremes of language. Somebody who used so much language in Nabokov's case, and then someone who tried to use the least amount of language as possible in Beckett's. And I think having those two voices in my ear and thinking like, oh, I love both of these writers so much, but what is the common denominator? They're so different as stylists, but they both cared so much about how the work sounded. That became important to me. And also as a reader, I don't care about what happens in a book. I don't care what people are doing or where they are. I care about how it all sounds. So it gives me the most opportunity as a reader to inhabit someone else's world and feel it first rather than to think about it first.
Yeah, that resonates with me. I'm curious if there are specific Nabokov and Beckett texts that were kind of gateway drugs for you. And then another thing I guess I hear you talking about a lot and that I see a lot in your work is this notion of immediacy, both in content and form, like that idea of kind of stripping away metaphor, that immediacy of contact between text and reader, text and writer. I'm curious how you think about immediacy in your fiction, in content and form, and then your favorites by Beckett and Nabokov.
Oh, Lolita is, it's a controversial answer, but it's a great book. And I think what's most interesting about it is its reputation for being a book about a girl who seduces an older man, when it's really just about abuse. And there are so many really gut-wrenching scenes in there where Nabokov is making it very clear it's not about the sexy thing that happens between an older man and I think she's 10 or 11 in the book when Humbert meets her. But it's really about the delusional thinking on the man's part, but that he also recognizes that he's destroying her life. Anyway, so I remember as a young girl myself thinking it was a really extraordinary balancing act between trying to make this character not completely repulsive, but at the same time, he is. I just loved that, but I also loved the words in it. The Defense is also a great book by him about a chess player that I really love. And then Beckett, of course, I love Waiting for Godot. I was asked by a friend in high school to be the dramaturge for a production of that he wanted to do, which never happened. But I was reading Deirdre Bair's biography of him, and I just fell in love with everything about him. But again, there too, I think he has a reputation for doing something that I think he actually didn't do. So people say that his work, it doesn't have any emotion in it. He was focused on these really dry sentences. But if you read his work, it's all incredibly emotionally melodramatic, I think. I mean, it's all about these old guys who are thinking about something in the past and like this one moment that they obsess over and somebody that they were in love with. So it's really dramatic and it's really emotional to, I think, a really exaggerated degree, but he hides it in this language that people assume is stripped down, not only in terms of the mechanics of how the language works, but the emotion is somehow muted. And I actually think that it's the opposite. So I guess I was interested in how both those texts were thought about and interpreted, but then my feeling about them and the things I loved about them were different. To the immediacy question, Beckett is so great at that, and so is Kathe Koja, and I read her work. I think when I was 13, I found Strange Angels in a bookstore in California at the now defunct Tower Records. And I just saw the picture of her on the back cover. I don't know if you've seen those photos of Kathe, but they're just like an 80s and 90s dream with the hair and the leather jacket. And she's an incredibly beautiful woman. And I was like, I want to be that. And then, of course, the book sounded fascinating. And, she has this great stream of consciousness style that I always tell people, that's the voice that's in my head still. And I have to, when I'm writing things, I have to like get the Kathe out of a first draft because I'm just always copying her voice because it's so unique and so powerful. She can pack so much into a paragraph. There's so much movement in terms of action that she can put into a page. It just feels like downloaded directly into your brain. I love that feeling. I guess for me, the immediacy comes from just the observing part of it. If you're as particular as possible about describing what you're seeing and you don't think so much about trying to convince the reader to think about the text the way that you do or to get out from it what you feel, I put all this stuff in. I mean, when I'm editing for other writers and I'm asking them to edit more, to take out more, they're so worried that the reader won't see like how smart their work is. But it sounds less smart when you can see the author thinking and explaining, right? I hate that as a reader. Give me my space. Let me figure it out. So I think when I'm writing or when I'm editing, I'm just thinking like, how can I best see what is going on between these two people? And I think gesture is really important. Not so much what people say, but how they're looking at each other, where they're looking, and how they interact with objects. I'm obsessed with that. Any person that I've done editing for will tell you that's just like the number one thing I just put on every page. It's like, it's not just that they're just two people in some random space and they're exchanging these words, but it's like, how are they interacting with things? How do they hold things? Where are they directing their gaze? And then how are they seeing other bodies moving in space? And that's the thing that I think a lot of writers who are just starting out or just figuring out how to put a work together is that they forget how visual it has to be. And it's not about the ideas, but it's about we see when we're in a room with another person, we're watching them and we absorb so much from just seeing how they behave in a space, a real space with other people and other things. And that's the real challenge, right? Is describing the particularity of an individual person, a specific person, and how they relate to their environment. I just believe that that's how we learn about each other and about ourselves. What is it like to be a body in a space with other kinds of bodies? I think the trick is to balance that with how to get into a mental space. And so the way that the writer writes, that's the mental part. That's how you can hear the characters thinking, right? But you also have to see around the way that they see. And I think the way to see around them is to watch them interact with things in space. And to me, that's what makes a work feel immediate, is seeing first, I guess, rather than thinking.
I'm curious, because you did mention that your friend had asked you to do dramaturgy. Then the way you're speaking right now, I wonder, do you have a background in theater at all? Because, I don't know, it sounds like you're talking about props and people on a stage.
No, but I read a lot of plays when I was in high school because my step-grandfather was a theater director, and I remember spending the summer with my dad in Santa Barbara one year, and I was at his house, my step-grandfather's house, and he had a whole library of plays, and my twin sister Danielle and I spent a whole summer just reading plays, and we read a lot of them out loud to each other, or she would read one and she'd be like, this one's really good, and I would read it, a couple hours later. I think theater is the most underrated art form in a certain way, because when it's good, it's so great. It's so much better than watching a show or even watching a film. I love films too, but seeing something happen in front of you is super exciting. But 99% of the theater productions you see are terrible, or they're boring, or they're so artificial. You actually don't get that immediacy, despite the immediacy of the art form itself. I don't go to a ton of theater, but I do have friends who are great directors, like Kevin V. Smith. I just saw one of his shows recently. He's totally brilliant. But I have read a lot of plays. And of course, when I was really interested in Beckett, I read all of his stage stuff. I mean, it's great for dialogue. It's great for so many things. Harold Pinter is one of my favorite playwrights. Oh my gosh, what a great weirdo. His situation is so bizarre and they're so scary. I mean, if you're talking about someone who's not considered, or I don't consider myself a horror writer at all, but his works are really horrific and they're completely inscrutable in terms of motivation. And I love that about his work so much, is that you have no idea why the people do the things that they do, but you really feel the absence of information in his work. And I think he's just a master at giving you just enough that it hangs together, but leaving out so much that it gives you that feeling of it otherworldly, the absurdity and whatever. But it's scary, I think. When you leave out that information, I think that's what makes things horrifying, is not knowing what's causing the violence, what's causing the difficulties between people and their environment. It's the lack of information that makes things really scary. And that's why I think it's when you're watching a horror film, if you see too much, if you see the monster or you understand why the haunting is happening, right? It's never satisfying. It's so hard to finish a horror genre narrative in film or in writing. The problem is like you end up feeling like you have to say something, but it's way better if you don't say it.
Of course, we have to talk about Kathe Koja. You and I share a deep love and admiration for her fiction. In fact, as I brought up, she was the one who first told me to seek out your work. To me, there's nobody else who writes quite like her. I would say the same for you. You're two writers who, when I read your prose, I kind of just marvel at it. Like, I wish I could evoke some of the things you're doing, but it's like a magic trick. Not a trick, that cheapens it, but there's a kind of magic quality to your voices. In Kathe's work, there's this way she expresses subjectivity through prose style, the intermeshing of visceral description with the numinous. I could go on. And I see some of those things happening in your work as well. I was curious to hear from you, what are some of your favorite of Kathe's books? You mentioned Strange Angels. And what about her work is it that speaks to you?
Yeah, I think it was those first 4 novels that she did with that Dell imprint. Strange Angels was the first novel, and then I bought Skin, The Cipher, and Bad Brains, all, probably within the same year. And they're all just so good, and they're so prescient in how, she was writing about body modification and body horror stuff in the 90s. You know what I mean?
30 years ago, over 30 years ago.
And Kink is another great novel of hers about a couple inviting another person into their relationship and the damage that person does. I mean, that whole gender role fluidity and sexual stuff. I mean, she was also just doing so many decades before, it was cool to do it. And then that she was writing books that were in the horror section. They weren't vampire novels. They weren't ghost stories. And of course, there's always been writers who work on the edges of what we call horror, but she was really doing it in a way, I think I agree with you, that is still, to me, feels really fresh and surprising. And it's that, I think also because she cared about how the work sounded. So I was always interested in horror movies and scary things when I was a kid and still now, but to me, she felt like, oh, this feels more literary, quote unquote, than a lot of the other stuff that I had been able to find. And the writing seemed just as important as what she was writing about. So that's one thing that really inspired me. And that voice is just infectious. It gets in your head, Yeah, I'll just repeat myself, but I still feel the influence really strongly every time I sit down to write. I think she just created something that did not exist before her. And I recognized that right away as a young person. And her work was really emotional. I think Strange Angels, which is about a young man with schizophrenia who's an artist, and this older man who becomes obsessed with his work as a sort of gateway to a different kind of knowledge. And I had never heard the word schizophrenia when I was 13. I didn't know what it was. And I spent years of my life thinking I was going to be a psychologist because of that book. I like started reading all these books about schizophrenia and mental illness, and that relationship between Grant and the main character, was just, there was so much emotion in it. And there was also like Kathe in her later work is much more explicit with the homoerotic stuff, but it was definitely in the early books as well. Yeah, that really spoke to me as well as a young person. You can't really say enough about Kathe, I think, and the influence that she had in the genre at the time and outside of it. And she's also a great person. She's so supportive of other writers. She's been really active in the community. She's just a really generous person. I met her, I guess, 8-10 years ago now, and we became really good friends, like a friendship that I'm really grateful for every day. Along with Dennis Cooper, I think both of them are great examples of writers who have always been interested in being a part of the writing community in a way that is about giving up your time to anyone. You don't have to be an established writer. When I met Kathe, I don't think my first book had even come out yet, but both of them treated me like a real artist. My books are not well read or that well regarded or anything like that, but they really gave me that sense of belonging to a community before I had that sense for myself. And I think that has been a great example to me of like, how do I want to be a writer amongst other writers? And that's just as important as making the books, I think.
What were some of the first few things that kind of left an impression on you that were baked into you? And we like also to talk about, things that haunt us. They don't necessarily need to be your favorites. They don't necessarily need to be things you liked, but things that just kind of stick in your brain and that you go back to again and again.
Just peek over at my bookshelf right now. A book that I think I never actually read, but my twin sister read in the 5th grade was Pet Sematary by Stephen King. And I remember her saying, she read it like 10 times or something when we were kids. And she said it was the book that taught her the most about marriage as a young person, that book is about marriage. And I think about that a lot because as someone who read a ton of whatever, I don't, the labels and categories only do so much work, but what we would call just horror, genre horror, straight, that's the section you're going to go to in the library or the bookstore. Stephen King is a great example of somebody who is a great storyteller, has written some wonderful stories, narratives, but also is interested in people. And there's so much in what is overlooked by people who only read strictly literary fiction in those books that's really about human relationships. And I guess there were just a lot of things like that growing up, or movies, of course. So many things I love. I just saw the new Yorgos Lanthimos movie, Kinds of Kindness, which is great, but I remember watching Dogtooth whenever it came out 20 years ago and thinking, oh my gosh, I want to make things like that. He's so brilliant at creating just the most bizarre situations, but making them seem both real and extremely unreal at the same time. Joyce Carol Oates is another writer that I always try to mention to the point of just hating the sound of my own voice talking about her. But I think that she was doing things that every, young woman writer who's touted as being edgy, or which is a word I hate, or dark or whatever. I mean, she was doing all of that, even before Kathe, right? She was doing it in the 50s and the 60s. She wrote like 10 short story collections between the 60s and 70s that I've read. She wrote many more, of course, but every story is so good and so weird and so violent and so sexual, and experimenting with language. She has great control over atmosphere, I think, especially this kind of detached, the female experience of violence and romance, but the romance is always completely encased in the horrific aspects of patriarchy and sexual violence. She did it so many times and with such skill and such power, but nobody talks about her in that way. I think partly it's the problem of writing too much, that people, they just take it for granted. You're going to get, so she publishes 3 books a year, and maybe not every single one is great, but she's written like 60 really great books in her career. And that's like way more than most of us can even, most of us can't even write one or half of one that approaches what she's done at her best. I don't know if they still teach Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been, that short story in school, but I read it in high school, and I read a couple of stories from Heat, a collection, when I was in junior high. I think about them all the time. I love short stories. I love writing short stories. And every time I think like, oh, I just did something and I'm pleased with it for 2 seconds. But then I read, I go back to Joyce's work and I just think like, oh yeah, like she already did it. She did more. She's like 100 years ahead of me and a lot of people. And I think that her influence is not appreciated at all. Of course, people think of her as a great writer. But I think as a great writer, who people don't read, people of a certain age, just overlook her completely. And people get so excited about Cormac McCarthy, who has written some, really great books. But she is so dark and so intense, just dealing with all of the hot button issues that we think, all of these young people now are, I'm not young, but, that people are doing now. And it's like hailed as so avant-garde, and again, she was doing it 6 years ago. So yeah, she's a really important person for me too. I think she's a great example of how labels contribute to our understanding of literature, right? No one ever said of her like, here's this woman who's writing in this niche, like dark, small imprint, small publisher. She had the luck to kind of be immediately recognized as a great American writer. But I think what happened is that it overshadowed like her influence or a potential influence to people writing in the same vein around the same topics, that people don't look at her work because they just assume, oh, she's just writing these bestsellers or these mainstream books. And there's really not much that's mainstream about, especially that early first 30 years of her writing. So I always try to give a shout out to Joyce. Not that she needs any more people to buy her books, buy other books too, but yeah, I don't want her to be forgotten as a real, an outsider. I think of her as definitely totally outsider writer who just happened to be immediately adopted into the mainstream, into the canon.
You're preaching to the choir, both Miriam and I. I think recently we were both saying, for both of us, she's probably our favorite writer of that generation. I would also say, frankly, Stephen King deserves to be ranked among the greatest writers of his generation as well. But again, there is this kind of dismissal. With each writer, it happens in a different way. Joyce Carol Oates, as you say, maybe by some people she's perceived as not transgressive, and she's exciting, she's visceral. She remains one of the most confrontational writers. And Stephen King, I think, sometimes is dismissed as a genre writer when he's so beyond doing the kind of genre-confined stuff. It doesn't make sense to think of him only in those terms. So anyways, I just want to completely agree with you.
Yay!
Yeah.
I mean, she wrote a book about Jeffrey Dahmer from Jeffrey Dahmer's perspective.
What a masterpiece.
Zombie. It's such a great book. I just really feel so aligned with her interest in the darkest aspects of humanity. She's not writing from her life. She's writing almost purely from this imagination, this obsession with her own imagination. Dennis Cooper, I think, does the same thing. Just really prioritizes imagining, I guess, and imagining in a dark place, which obviously is something that I also like to do. But yeah, I'm really glad to hear that you also are fans, because I love her. Transgressive is the word I was looking for. Yes, that's the category that's so big now, right? And she's like the grandmother, I think.
I listened to an interview with her in which she was talking about her interest in these kind of American ballads or American mythology. Of course, she wrote Blonde about Marilyn Monroe, and My Sister, My Love about John Benet Ramsey, and Blackwater is about this poor woman who we don't really know much about, who died with the Democrat. I forget his name. I think a lot of horror, there's a lot of like mythology. You were talking earlier about things that are shrouded in mystery being even more frightening than what's in plain light of day. And in Northwood, it's a novella with a very unconventional format. Some have referred to it as a poetic novel in fragments. And something that really struck me about it, as someone who loves Ovid, I love fairy tales. I think because you use that poetic format in which you had the ability to use poem titles, like you have one for Daphne and one for, I forget the term, but it's like someone who reads guts as if they're oracular, like the I Ching, I guess. You're so good, in my opinion, at meshing a certain atmosphere or a certain form with what would be demanded of by the narrative and the characters. And so what was it about Northwood that led you to adopt this more experimental mode of expression compared to something like The Seventh Mansion?
Oh, it's hard to talk about that book because I don't like it. I know, it was an experiment, and I don't think it's a successful one. One of the books I love the most is Anne Carson's Autobiography of Red. I love all of her work. Obviously, that is just a great, tremendous, one of the best books that's ever written, ever in the history of writing. Another book I found when I was in high school, and a huge impact on me. With Northwood, I went through this period of thinking, like, I'm going to be a poet. And because I was reading a lot of poetry at that time. And there are so many great poets, of course, especially great narrative poets. And I put together a cycle of poems that, they're not, it's such bad poetry, which is what my editor said at Catapult. She said, you have a book here, but you haven't written it yet, and these are really bad poems. But if you think of the story in here as being a novel and this really being prose, there might be something here if you work on it a bit. And she said it needs more moss. And I remember her saying that and thinking, like, yeah, I don't really know what that means, but I totally know what it means. And so I worked for a year or so with her, making it into the book that's eventually published. So it was a story that I thought needed to be told in this way, coupled with just a delusional belief that I could do that form justice in any way. Again, I really think I failed miserably. It taught me a lot about my limits as a writer, and sometimes I think you write a book too soon. You're trying to learn how to do it when you're doing it. Maybe if I had spent more time on it or something, I don't know, I would have realized later, like, oh, this is not really working. But there's parts of it maybe that hold up. I don't know. It's certainly a beautiful book. The design team did a great job. I think the parts, more to your question, that don't work for me are the parts that you talked about, which is, pulling in this mythology. There's a lot of tarot stuff in there, which tarot's just become like a sort of unbearable popular culture phenomenon. Me and my twin have been reading tarot since we were 13. So I, of course, have a great affection for it, but I also just, once you see a tarot deck at Urban Outfitters, it sort of spoils your sense of it as like, a special tool or whatever. But yeah, and then all the myths. And I think it can feel at the time like you're getting, you're putting these things in there and they have these connections to other things. And Anne Sexton has done all of this like so well. She was another big influence for that book. I can't remember the name of the book she did. That's all like mythology related poems, but they're just brilliant. So good. So intensely about the female experience. I think I just overshot that mark of, thinking, oh, I'm going to use these different elements to make the work richer. I'm a great imitator, I always say, because I don't write from my life. All I can do is watch how other people do things. All of my ideas are from a gesture in a film or, a line in another book. And it's just up to me to try to copy the experience that I have reading and watching other people's work. So Northwood is a great example of, I think, too much imitation and not enough actual, the work never became really my own. And it really suffered for that. I think so many times when we're talking about writing in interviews and on book tours, we make it sound like the writer produced this thing and it's great and they're happy with it. And I think sometimes it's also good to hear that it's okay to say you're not always going to satisfy yourself, let alone anyone else. Hopefully there's something in there that somebody else can get something out of, but it's not a book that does anything for me. Every time I see it, I'm like, oh no. But that's okay. Once it's published, Kathe really taught me this. She said, once the book is out there, it doesn't belong to you anymore. You don't know what people are going to do with it. You don't know how they experience it. And it really has nothing to do with you. And I think that's true. I think it's great advice. It's the same reason why I don't get any satisfaction of seeing my work on a bookshelf. I worked at a bookstore for 7 years in California, and it was all about like, someday my book is going to be in a bookstore and other people are going to read it and it's going to be in a library. And I remember when I published Heartbreaker, and of course there's like a wonderful feeling when you get your box of books from the publisher and it's like a thing and it looks like a book. And that's really exciting, but it lasts for like 2 seconds. I don't know about your experience with this, but it's really hard to get anything out of the published work. But I think that's fine. I think it's much better than worrying about, what people are going to think about it. It doesn't matter. You're already on to the next thing, right? By the time something comes out. That distance is probably really necessary for your sanity. Sorry, I got off in a tangent there, but
Well, I
Northwood,
liked
yeah.
Northwood. But I understand what you mean, and it's good. I think you're right. Like, it's a measure of your progress as a writer to look back on something and find it cringy means that you're probably much improved since then, but it worked on me.
Hopefully.
So
I can relate to some of the things you were saying earlier. When I look at any of my books that are printed, I can't bear to look at them, and I will only do so if I'm doing a reading or something. I just want to edit it. I basically, once they're out there, I'm like, I don't even want to know what people are reading because it's just going to make me cringe. But I also think writers are probably the worst judges of their own work, if that's fair for me to say. We can't judge our own work. We can, to some degree, determine when it's finished. But even then, it's difficult to know when it's really finished.
And you're not the reader, right? You know what I mean? It's like you're not the audience for what you're writing. You know, you can enjoy and love doing it in the moment. And that's really what's important, right? Is that it's satisfying. It's so satisfying and so fun to write. But it's not fun or satisfying to have that writing, you know, be preserved in a form that you no longer have control over. So that part's not fun. I became a writer because I wanted to write the type of books that my twin and I felt like, you know, didn't exist or whatever. You wanted to write the kind of work that you want to read, but you're not the reader, obviously. And you just have such a biased opinion of what you did. You just have to let go of being a reader, I guess. So thank God that there's so many other people to read. You don't have to read your own books.
How do you begin a novel? Like, what is the starting point for you? For instance, did you know The Seventh Mansion would be a novel when you started writing it? You mentioned you don't plot, you don't make outlines. I hadn't done that until my third novel. I will now never write a novel without an outline again, but that's a whole other story. But yeah, what is your novel writing process look like?
Well, I can show you something that the people listening to this won't be able to see, but The Seventh Mansion came from seeing this little cutie. It's an image of St. Pancratius, the relic that is in Switzerland. He's wearing this beautiful suit of armor that these nuns made for him in the 17th century, I believe. And it's like a silver skirt, and he has these thigh-high boots and this beautiful cape. And I didn't know that these relics existed, even though I was Catholic in high school and obsessed with saints. But when I found out about these bodies that had been bedazzled basically by nuns for a couple hundred years, I thought, wow, like it seems so weird and so gross to us. And a lot of them look grotesque. I mean, I think Pancratius's relic and his suit of armor is one of the few that looks to the contemporary eye, maybe a lot of people wouldn't think is beautiful, but it doesn't look too weird, I guess. He looks pretty majestic. And I was thinking about what it would be like to love a body like that in, you know, our contemporary times in this part of the world. We don't want to think about bodies and death, and we don't admire skeletons. But that, you know, in this particular period of history, in this very specific context, the bodies weren't seen as horrific. And I thought there has to be someone out there who still would see something like that and love it. To what extent do you love something like that? Well, that, I mean, obviously the book thinks about that in a very particular way. But it reminded me of a person I met on a paraphilia website that I was a moderator for very briefly many years ago. And there was a whole section of the site where these people who self-identified as necrophiliacs were on. And it was the one fetish, or whatever you want to call it, that I just couldn't understand. I was like, none of these people actually have relationships with bodies, right? It's all romantic. It just exists inside their heads, right? They fall in love with a tombstone, basically, and the idea that there's this woman who died when she was young, and you go to the cemetery and you have this feeling about this dead person. I just couldn't understand it because I thought there's no person there. There's no personality. Like, what are you having a relationship with? I think that one of the worst things a person can do is objectify another person. And I think that's where all violence comes from. And what makes it hard to live on the earth as a human is that some cultures have invented this ability to objectify another living thing, or even a non-living thing. I just had a hard time imagining what these people were thinking about. But I got to know this co-moderator who went by Graveyard, who's 19 years old, lived in England. And they had sent me a picture of their ideal body, which is one of the bog bodies. You know, it's the lady, and she still has this long hair. And Graveyard was like, this is my ideal. And I was like, okay. But they're all like super nice people. They weren't creepy. It wasn't about going out and killing people and having sex with their bodies. It was really about being in love with something, in my mind, this is how I interpret it, that no one else could enter into the relationship, if that makes sense. Like nobody else could know about it. You could just own it yourself. But it's also what made these people feel really lonely, right? The community can't really be a part of a relationship where the other person in the relationship, quote unquote, can't speak for themselves, right? It can only be reported by the lover to say, this is consensual in some way or whatever. It's like, it's working out. Just take my word for it. And I think those types of relationships are impossible. I think the community has to be able to participate in a relationship, no matter how private it is, in order for that relationship to be healthy or stable. But anyway, I saw that body and it reminded me of this relationship I had with this person. I mean, we weren't even really friends, but some conversations we had and with the other people on the site. And I remember somebody posting and saying, there's no book that exists that describes how we feel that isn't like a serial killer textbook or something. You know, there's nothing written about the topic that's not about a deviant psychology or something. And I thought maybe someday I'll be able to wrap my mind around this. And when I saw that picture of Pancratius, I thought, there it is. Like, I can imagine sitting in a church, you see that body, and you can make a story about it, that it can appear beautiful to you, and not just beautiful, but as a person. It's not just a skeleton dressed up in some crazy outfit. There's a person there. I'm just really interested in relationships that people have that are usually entirely one-sided in a certain way, but just the power and the destructiveness of imagination that can create a relationship where none would seem to be possible to exist. And we're so good at like doing that, right? We're so good at potentially loving each other, I think. And a lot of times it gets really messed up, but that we can extend this romantic imagination into things that other people might see as disgusting, not even alive. If we're talking about metaphors, I mean, if we could do that with nature, if we can remind ourselves that there's this whole other non-human world around us, that if we don't love it, if we're not in love with it, we're going to kill it, which is what we're doing now. I'm really interested in writing about things that are scary to me or that are concerning and thinking, well, maybe if I just look at it for a while, I don't know, I'll feel less worried about it. It never works because there's always something else to worry about. I did feel like by writing about Z's interest in this particular body, it helped me understand, it helped me look at other bodies in a different way. And I went to visit that relic after I wrote the book, and wow, he was spectacular in person. And I remember my daughter, who was like 8, she said, can you teach me how to pray so I can talk to, and we're not a religious family. So I thought, right there, it just proves to you that there is something about these relics that has such power. You want to communicate even across what we consider to be life and death. I think that's really an interesting thing to think about. I never carried a notebook with me as a writer. And I always thought it was so pretentious and annoying to see, writers was on the bus and I overheard something. I wrote it down. But now I have been carrying a notebook. And what I love to do is go see movies and write when I'm watching films, because I was watching a movie and somebody just talked about an umbrella. They went out and it was raining. There was no umbrella. And for some reason, I can't remember what it was about that, but it gave me an idea about something else. And then it was eventually the basis of the novel that I'm working on right now. That has nothing to do with umbrellas or rain. But yeah, I've just been going with my notebook and writing down the things that strike me. And then you just realize it's so much faster doing it when you actually have the paper with you. So it's always, like I said, I just copy other people. If I see something or hear something or read something that I really like, I think, gosh, I just wish I could do this thing. I could emulate that feeling that I get. And then you have to think, where does that feeling come from? And it's just one moment, one gesture. Who knows how it works, but it's all just copying, being inspired by people who are a lot better at what they do than I am.
Going back to the same interview with Jennifer Solheim, great interview. You had mentioned that Z had appeared to you as a kind of modern day saint, which meant he had to be an outsider. So you kind of touched on that a little bit. And I just found this to be fascinating, especially, speaking to you, putting it together, you see the relic, and then you have this idea of a character in your mind who would be worthy suitor for said relic. And I found it to be a fascinating, almost alchemical description of character generation. Is this typical of the origins of your characters?
No. I mean, I don't know. It really comes from, I think most of the time, you sit down and you start writing and something happens. The characters are there and then you just keep watching what they're doing. And it's usually something messed up. Something troubling. You're like, don't do that. I wouldn't do that. It's not a good idea. So the character part, who knows where that comes from most of the time. I think maybe it's different for novels. I haven't written enough novels to say, but I was also a vegan animal rights activist at that time when I was writing the book, and so I guess you could say in some ways that character is like the closest to me, even though I'm nothing like Z. But maybe that's where he came from. But that's really an anomaly. I don't think there's any other example I can think of character-wise. It's really just a situation. There's just a moment. You start writing. These people are here. Like there's a story in Rag, the first story, where someone's in a pizza parlor and then there's a woman who has a miscarriage in the bathroom and it's her relationship with the kid who's working there. And, it was just an image I had of the bathroom, I guess. And then who was inside of it and who did they talk to when they came out of it? I wish I had a more satisfactory answer to that question, but who knows where they come from. That's the delightful part, though. I mean, I can't imagine all these writers who base their characters off people that they know or themselves. I just think this is so boring. I like being me. I like living my life. I have a really nice life, but I would just be bored to death writing about it. So I already get to be me, and that's enough, right? I get to be me most of the time. And I think for my twin sister and I, we were always interested in making up stories about other people and being other people, and books are a great way to experience that, or at least to watch other people be other people. And writing is definitely all about that pleasure. I'm not the people that I write about. I don't even get to feel like I inhabit them when I'm writing them at all. It's really observing them, and they're really still as strange to me as an actual stranger. But I still get to watch them in a very voyeuristic way that's extremely pleasing. It's like when you go on a walk at night and you can see into people's houses and when the lights are on. Like, what is more fun than that? When you just get to think like, wow, there's this whole life happening, right? And you feel a little bit weird staring. That's what I like the most, I think. More than living, I really like to watch other people live. I just would spend all my time doing that if I could. And I do spend a great deal of it, reading and watching movies and writing.
As you were talking about The Seventh Mansion, just something I've been thinking a lot about with your fiction, that novel's a great example. You write brilliantly about obsession. I also think of stories like Stiletto and Shop Lady, among others. What keeps pulling you back to this theme or this experience of obsession?
Kathe, again, that's really what she writes about, isn't it? I mean, people who are so obsessed to the nth degree with someone or something. It's easy to make a dramatic scenario out of obsession, I guess. And so sometimes I wonder, is it a crutch for me in some way, or is it like cheating? I don't know. But it does seem to be what I am drawn to write about. So, you go with what comes to you naturally. I'm interested in how obsession can drive people to do not so great things for themselves and for other people. And I always say this too in interviews, that my experience as an identical twin. I'm not just Maryse. I don't think of myself as an individual person. I think of myself as Maryse plus Danielle, Maryse plus a twin. It so deeply constitutes my experience of the world that I can't separate it from, I don't really have a Western notion of the self, I guess. And we always joke that if there had just been one Western philosopher who had been an identical twin, maybe everything would be different and liberalism wouldn't exist and the world would be a better place. But I've never experienced loneliness. I don't know what that's like. I think it sounds horrible to even experience it for a moment, to feel like you're truly alone and that no one can understand you and you can't understand other people. Seems like it would be the worst possible way to exist in the world. And yet most people that I know would argue that that's the central quality of their life, is that they feel alone. And that so many things that they do is a reaction to that feeling of loneliness or fear of being lonely. Maybe, and this is just me, of course, making stuff up, but maybe that has something to do with my interest in obsession. It's like, loneliness is the scariest thing to me. I think violence comes out of that too, of just not feeling connected to other people. And so that it allows you to forget that other people and other living things are as living as you. So I'm just really interested in loneliness, I think. And then the obsession maybe just comes out of that as a reaction to it, is people trying to be less lonely, but then ending up doing things that make them feel worse. I would love to write about somebody who doesn't do that and is successful, like making connections. I just finished another collection, and I found a way to be interested in people who manage to overcome like the dire circumstances of their loneliness. I'm just interested in what drives people to do the things that they do, and the secret things, right? It's like, I'm a pretty vanilla person. Like I said, most of my life is just watching other people do things. If I think about like the most obsessive I've been or whatever, I can only imagine it's a billion times worse for a lot of other people. And I just want to know, like, when I meet someone, I think the first thing I want to know about them is like, what is the thing that really obsesses them, I guess, that drives them? And those are the things you don't usually get to talk about when you first meet someone. And writing is just a way to get to that point really quickly, is to find the secret stuff. When I was a housekeeper for 13 years, I'd read my clients' diaries, which I admit is a terrible thing to do and really bad. And I apologize to the people that I did that to. But, you know, I think there's just that interest in, like, how are other people really living? And books give you that, and art gives you that. And it's just like, you can become addicted. Maybe I'm obsessed with that. It's like just spying on other people. It's that thing about looking through other people's windows. And again, that feels important and special to me, but I think that's probably true of all of us. And that's good. We should be curious about each other, and we should want to know the deepest, darkest things about each other. We should ask those questions, and we should talk about them.
I find that relatable. I'd say I'm a fellow voyeur. It's interesting you're talking about loneliness, because something that often comes up on our podcast is that writing is so solitary. You spend a lot of time alone. Paradoxically, I'm a bit of a late bloomer as a writer. I'm old-ish, I guess. I'm in my early 30s. I'm probably not. Relatively speaking, I'm young, but I only got up the courage to start, really taking myself seriously. And before that, I think I was a more obsessive and lonely person. And I do think that writing, it's a salve. So yeah, like I said, it's a paradox. You spend a lot of time by yourself, but in a very enriching way, in which, I don't have a twin, but I'm very good friends with myself as a result of having a lot of fun all by myself. I did notice you don't have much in terms of social media. And if I were not writing, I know like so many different ways to try to find people on social media. So I have to cut myself off from that and really create an insular world. There's probably a different reason why you don't have social media, but I was like, maybe she's the same as me. I don't know.
Well, yeah, it's probably true that I would use it in that way, but unfortunately, just a Luddite, in the original sense of the term, which Luddites are pretty radical people. I'm an anarchist, I'm a communitarian. You can only really know the people that you know, right, that you live, that you can see their face, their actual face, not the way that we're seeing each other, but you have to be with the people in the space in the same time, I think, to really say that you know them. And it doesn't mean you can't have interesting or meaningful connections in other ways. I have, a great friend that I've never met in person, that we just leave WhatsApp messages for each other. And of course, I feel close to her, but I'm not a part of her life. And she's not really a part of mine in a way that where we depend on each other. And I think social media, I think all forms of media and mediated relationships where technology is really the thing that makes it possible to be together. It makes us imagine that we can be together and be apart. And I don't think that's possible, really. And I think once we make that error and think, I can be in the world by like staring at a two-dimensional, screen, and I'm going to experience something that's just as real as this actual world. To me, it just seems hellish. It just seems like there's so many bad things that come out of believing that. But it's easy to think that you are connecting with people. So I did have an Instagram for a while, and then my sister ran it for me. And I met a ton of people that way and had great experiences. But then I realized, like, I'm spending time, and it wasn't a ton of time, but it was still, time. Writing messages or, like, waiting for the DM or whatever. And then, at the end of the day, I'm like, but I don't know, like, I have friends and I have family and I have like people that I see in the real world, and I want to preserve that time for them instead of trying to fill up more and to get more in this other way, if that makes sense. I obviously am talking to you on a computer. I have a phone. I'm not happy about that. So it's not like I'm not a purist. I don't live up to my ideals, but I just try to limit it, I guess, as much as possible. Because the technology is a thief. It's a thief of our time. And it makes us think that we can live in a world that can never be as rich as the world that is really around us. That's the boring Luddite reason for that, for the social media thing. It just doesn't feel
not
real
boring
at
at
the
all.
end of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's relatable. We're fellow Luddites. I keep trying to convince Mike if he could get on board with sawdust toilets so that we could live off the grid together.
Do it. It's good.
That's the ideal. I know, right? It's not that bad, Mike. It's not that bad.
No.
It's not that bad.
I'm not saying
Yeah.
I'm not completely closing that door yet, but
You'll get there. You'll get there.
Yeah. I feel like I feel a kind of pressure from people that I have to use.
Yes.
It's so frustrating. Yeah.
I didn't even want to put an author photo on my books. And I remember the weird pushback about that was like, well, unfortunately, we live in a world where it's important to people like what you look like and that they see that like you're a younger lady. You know what I mean? I mean, I'm 41 now, but then I was in my 30s and I don't know. It wasn't like a good reason. And I actually don't think it does what people think it does. This is the other part of it, is that people just repeat they just regurgitate the same thing. Like, this is what people expect, and that it equals to this outcome of like people engaging with you or buying your books or whatever. And I don't think it does, unless you're extraordinary at using those tools. My friend Lindsay Hunter is a great writer, lives in Chicago. She's like so funny and she's amazing in her Twitters. The only Twitter feed that I've ever thought like that person is so themselves also in that media, and they just use it in a way that I think it was intended to be used. And then it's great, right? I don't know how it translates for Lindsay in terms of if she feels like, it has this correlation with her life as a writer and like sales or whatever, but maybe it does. But yeah, I think people just say, I think this publicity, people are like, this is what's good, and then is it, you can't really measure it. So in my case, the little that I did, has done nothing, right? Because very few people buy my book. So, I mean, maybe the argument could be, it's like, you just need to do it better. But I don't know. It's just the trend. And then what happens with everything. It's like, everyone else is doing it. You do it too. But I don't think my picture on my book does anything except make people expect me to be whatever. I always complain that the most attention I get as a writer is from people who identify as being in the horror genre, the world or whatever, and I get invited to go to horror literary things, and I'm always just like, no, but I'm not. But I think my pictures, because I'm, as I was in high school, like a goth, the earrings and stuff, I haven't helped myself at all. Any scrap of visual information people get about you, right? They make all these assumptions and then they relate that to your work in a way that doesn't really benefit you in the end, I think. But I just ignore them, I would say. Just do what you're comfortable with. It doesn't matter. Because people just say these things and they don't have anything to back it up. More busy work for the writer, really,
I know. And it gets in the way of the actual work. This notion of how we market ourselves, which algorithms we get plugged into and so on and so forth, it can be very constrictive and suffocating sometimes. So
yes, for sure. But it's also not something you're completely in control of, because you're not in control of, who reads your books and how you fit in with what other people are reading and how they're thinking. And I guess you have to let go of a little bit of that too, but it can be a little bit frustrating. And I think especially for women, now it's like there's this transgressive, dark, whatever, and that I just find a completely miserable pigeonhole to be in, really. It's just like, it's like just cool, I mean, the imprint that I published the most with FSG, I mean, definitely has that aura to it. It's just like, oh, all of these cool whatever people, and they are all cool. And it's great. We had, Emily Bell, our editor, she's just great at finding writers doing similar things. But it's all, I don't know. It's weird to be in an era where categories are on the one hand so strictly scrutinized, but on the other hand, like, literally could not be a stronger reification of the category than we are living in right now. And this just could be a process that we have to go through to finally get rid of many of them. But it's an annoying place to be in at the particular moment. But there's good stuff everywhere, right? I think on some levels it's a great time to be a reader right now because there's so many great small presses and there is more, of a willingness to talk across genres and to make different kinds of connections. And so maybe that's the really positive thing that's coming out now. There's still labels being thrown around, mostly by, marketing to try to, imagine an audience for something before it even exists for the audience. But at the same time, I can't relate at all to people who say that the novel is dead or writing is dead or people don't read short stories or people aren't reading. Like, people read. People are still, I'm reading. I go to the bookstore. There's tons of books. And, I read so many great books every year. There's just more and more and more to be excited about. And on the other hand, I think there's so many alternatives to the quote unquote mainstream publishing and the big five, or maybe it's four now. I don't know what the latest mergers have done to collapse that. I think the predicted demise of publishing and of reading, it just never happens, You could read George Gissing's book, what is it called, New Grub Street, about writing, and it was written like 110 years ago, and that's the same thing that people say all the time. I've been saying since I've been alive, which is, people aren't going to read books, and the novel is dead, and it's not, it's flourishing. It's all pretty amazing, I think, the time that we're living in. I have piles of books I won't read before I die.
Likewise.
Maybe not all of it's from this particular moment in time, but a lot of it certainly is. So, are you guys reading anything that you're really excited about right now, or?
Well, we were reading a lot of your stuff in preparation for this interview. I'm trying to think. Maybe not things I've read recently, but speaking of like transgressive women, I really like Fernanda Melchor. She's a Mexican writer, wrote Paradais and Hurricane Season. To check my Goodreads. What have you been reading recently, Mike, that you're excited about?
The last book that really knocked me over was not a new book, but Edith Wharton's The Custom of the Country. It is this sort of like vicious dissection of high society while also kind of depicting some of the romance of it. She's really grappling with those tensions in ways that are always exciting to me. So that book knocked me over. And honestly, her collection Heartbreaker was just one of the most exciting books I've read all year as well.
We were talking about Joyce Carol Oates earlier. I saw here on my Goodreads. Have you read much of her publications under the pseudonym Rosamund Smith?
Yes, I did. I read a lot of stuff when I first discovered her. Yeah.
I just read Snake Eyes. It was really cool to look at restorative justice and art and genteel, well-intentioned suburban middle class. It was a lot of fun. It was pretty dark and delicious, as most of her stuff tends to be. How about you? Have you read anything exciting recently?
I've read so many things that I'm so excited about. I just discovered this lady, Friederike, I don't know, it's German, Mayröcker. There's an umlaut over the O, so that probably means something. I can't even describe how good it is. What an amazing stylist, a great stream of consciousness. And it's all so interior. It's just really about her life and like her responses to things. You feel like you're inside of her brain, and it's so fascinating and it's so human and weird. And you see a picture of her in her office. She died a little while ago. She was in her 80s. She's got all these shelves in her office, but there's hardly anything on the shelves, and everything just piled around her, just like she's in the middle of a forest of papers and books. And that's what it's like to read her work. It's like you're in the forest of her consciousness. Elfriede Jelinek is a huge influence on me. Her book, The Piano Teacher, and the Haneke's great film based on that. She's always just been a really important writer and a playwright. If we're talking about theater, incredible works for the stage, which is what she's really known for outside of America. But one of her big novels, The Children of the Dead, just came out this year, was translated, and I've been waiting for like 10 years. And it is crazy. It's just what I expected. So many of her books don't really have a plot. Piano Teacher probably has the most plot of any of them that I've read. It's a zombie novel about the ghost of the Holocaust of Austria's political history converging in this small town in the Alps, and it's just one really disgusting, horrific description of these bodies coming back in this place with really no plot outside of it. It's about 500 pages or so. Just tremendous. And what I love about her work is that, some of the more abstract stuff, like she wrote a novel called Greed that's really about a lake that this policeman puts the body of a young girl in. And it's really nothing about the murder so much as this polluted body of water And this new novel of hers, well, it's not new, but newly translated, it's the same feeling of like, there's something really boring about it in a sense, because she just doesn't pay any attention to the conventions of like writing fiction or write a narrative at all. You just get to watch her attend to the things that she's really interested in. She won the Nobel Prize. She doesn't need me to sing her praise anymore, but she's just a great thinker and a really interesting, very humane person, but extremely uncompromising view of humanity. I'm not quite as pessimistic as she is, but I love her. And I read a wonderful book. The book is in French. I don't think she's French. Noël Rivaz, and it's called With Animals. It was just translated this year. It's so brilliant. Everyone just buy this book and read it, please. It's about a farmer and his relationship with his wife. And at first you think, and the book is marketed in this way where it's like, oh, it's about how horrible men are and all this stuff. And this guy is just terrible. And he doesn't care about his wife and his kids. And he cares more about the animals on his farm. But really, when you read it, it becomes a sort of amazingly generous portrait of a kind of masculinity that is just, it's a person who's speechless. It's in the first person. And he's writing about all these things and about his wife who gets cancer and has an affair with the farmhand. But he can't write about how he feels about her, about tenderness. And so he ends up writing about all these other things. But it's not a hateful book about this man or the kind of masculinity he represents. It's really about like the feelings are there and how deep they are. What happens when you don't have the language and I think a social, political context for the creation of that language to be able to say or to show really as well how much you care about someone else. I think it's just brilliant. I think the way she does it, it's just great. Read it. Buy it. It's maybe one of my favorite books that I've ever read.
Yeah. What was the title of the first book you held up, Maryse?
The Communicating Vessels.
Okay, thank you.
So many brilliant people, dead and alive, making stuff for us.
So much to read. Just curious about your choice to omit quotation marks around dialogue. If you don't mind my asking.
There was a writer, I'm forgetting his name. He wrote a novel about Schmidt, whatever. Kind of writer I don't like or care about, but he said he doesn't like the way he thought that quotations look like bugs on the page. I remember reading that. Why did balloons just appear on my screen? That was very strange.
Because you said about Schmidt? I don't know. Yeah. That's eerie.
Wow. That was very strange. I remember reading one of his novels when I was, 11, and I came across that quote in the foreword. I think of quotes as indicating that, like, this is what really happened or this is what someone really said. And I feel really nervous about ever doing that, about making those types of claims to, like, accuracy or something, I guess. That's one of the reasons. But I think the other thing is it's just easier to make the dialogue and the rest of the text more democratic, I guess you could say. So it's the sound of it to me. It's like the way that the words run together. I find that quotations just really stop you. They do it on the page for a very specific reason. And if you want that is a great tool to stop the reader in a certain way to create a certain type of pause. But I like things to go together a little bit more. So that probably comes out of my affection for a lot of stream of consciousness writing. I mean, obviously, people have been not using quotes since the beginning of time. So it's not an unusual thing to do by any means. But it's interesting how many readers still get upset about it, though. People still don't read widely enough, I guess. I think some people see it as really pretentious. It's like, why not just use them? And I mean, I had people in my MFA program, instructors were like, just put the quotations marks. Punctuation is your greatest tool to control how something sounds. You know, and punctuation is also visual. So to the author of About Schmidt's point of them looking like bugs on the page, you want to think about the choice whether to use them or not, or to use an indentation like James Joyce did and a lot of other people have done, or use italics for dialogue. Yeah, I think those are all things that are worth considering, and to take them for granted, you just miss out on the opportunity to think about how you want your work to sound. But part of it's just, I never want to say, this is what the person said exactly, even though it's all made up. I just feel like it's too, I can't commit to that. Like, you know, maybe they said something different or more. I'm not a journalist, so I don't want to use quotation marks.
There is often a high demand for didacticism and a kind of moral earnestness I find your fiction exhilarating because there's this sophisticated moral ambiguity. And also, you've been talking a lot about observation. It's a non-judgmental observation. How do you think of this notion of quote unquote morality within the context of your fiction writing?
I mean, it's so overplayed, the dialogue about unlikable versus likable characters, which I can't even, give time to, right? That's not important to me. But I think it's connected to that, whether we can think of a character, and by extension, the writer who's writing about them, as being a moral person. The morality comes into play for me to always be careful about remembering, as I said in the beginning of the interview, that these fake people represent real people in real situations. And so you have to care about them. I think most writers do care about people that they write about. I guess treating them, not exploiting them, I guess. And that's a weird thing to say, but if you're writing about violence and the ways people hurt themselves and each other, I think for me it's really important to be careful about how I represent those things. Nothing's off limits to me. There's certainly things that are, not in terms of the subject matter, but in how they're presented. If you're inviting the reader to observe violent or painful or abusive, whatever situations, I think the morality is there in just how you try to present those things. I mean, it doesn't mean that every reader is going to have their interpretation of what is going too far or might feel exploitative or unnecessary, and you can't control that. But I do think that the morality comes from in your own feeling about what you're writing about. And being fair, I think, being as fair as possible. And in a lot of the work that I'm doing lately, the last collection that I wrote of stories, which hasn't been published yet, it's mostly male dyads, I guess. So I guess you could say they're homosexual in some way. But I noticed that I don't write about communities usually. I write about individuals. So I have a lot of characters that you might be able to say are gay or queer or whatever, but they would never use those labels for themselves, if that makes sense. They're not part of a community where these aspects of themselves are recognized or shared by the people around them. I do want to go back when we were talking about Z in the Seventh Mansion. I was talking about necrophiliacs, and Z's not a necrophiliac, right? She's something else. But I was careful never to use that word in the book because, again, when you use these labels, they imply that the person is a part of a group of people. And when we're talking about loneliness, my characters usually they're not a part of a group of people. One of my stories was in a queer anthology, a horror anthology. I think my editor misconstrued the person as, she used the word trans, and I was like, the person in the book wouldn't use that word for themselves, so I would never use it, and I don't even think about them existing in that world. Does that make sense? So I think part of the morality, too, for me, is thinking about not only the individual character, but how they might fit in with groups of people. And I think the responsibility of the writer really shifts when you're dealing with that, if that makes sense. And then I think there's just that moment when my agent had this question, is this the right representation of this person? And I was like, well, they're an individual person. They're not a metaphor for other people. They're experiencing something that to me is very personal to them and happened to be very personal to me as well. I think there's this quickness now to label things and to say, this is this type of fiction. This person is representing this group. And once you do that, you're inviting a whole other, you have a different responsibility, I think. But it's really interesting to think about those things, about the kinds of communities that your characters might or might not be engaged with, and labels that they might or might not put on themselves. And I'm really interested in the people who suffer precisely because they lack a sense of community. And I'm just careful about how I present those people, I guess, as representatives of themselves. They're not metaphors for anything else but themselves.
Another thing I picked up on in your fiction that was interesting to me was this knack you have for strategically withholding information, whether it be narrative or character information. I'm thinking particularly of a story like Home, which is included in your collection Heartbreaker. The characters' ages and motivations seem kind of deliberately and fascinatingly opaque. I see you employing similar ambiguity in a lot of your work. That's just one example. How do you determine what goes on the page and what stays off it in this regard? Does this ambiguity show up in your first drafts usually, or is it something that you arrive at over a process of multiple revisions?
Yeah, Home is a great example because it was the first story that I wrote that I felt like, oh, that's the kind of story that I wanted to write at the time. Now I think I might be moving in a different direction because I've done that type of story a lot. But I remember I worked with a poet in my MFA, and he read that story. And he said, just give them names. Like, it's so stupid and so pretentious, again, to not name your characters. And I was like, I'm not withholding the information on purpose. And he also had this whole thing about backstory. You know, you have to know everything about your character. Even if you don't put it in, you have to know everything about them. And I was like, I don't know those things. I don't know their names, which is why they don't have any names. It's not for me trying to like manipulate the reader and just like withholding because I'm a frigid mother and I don't love them enough to like give them that information or something. It's like, I just don't know. It's mysterious to me, talking about where the stories come from and stuff. I don't know. And I think the not knowing is worth preserving. Maybe I'm guilty of like not trying to know more or something. Particularly when I was writing Heartbreaker, I didn't really have a sense of the motivations for the characters. The things I really like to read a lot of times don't have that. But there's tons of books I love that are super psychological and that do give you all that rich stuff. And I'm not good at doing that, number one. I would love to be able to write a book that felt real in that way. And I don't have the skill to do it, just like I'm not good at writing plots. Stephen King's just like plot all day, right? Just comes out of him. Joyce Carol can write these big, epic books. My imagination isn't that big. So I just can't do that, which is partly why I don't. But it's not that I know things and then I take them out. That's for sure, at least back then. Now I see my writing going a different direction where there's a lot more talking, I guess. But I still feel like, yeah, everything that I know is in there. And the things that I don't know are not. The perspective that you have as a writer, and I think this is so individual to each person, and it can change over the course of your writing life. But I was pretty militantly, I think, committed to this thing of like, you just show, don't tell anything. But it was also because I don't have anything to tell. I just have the showing part of it, and so I really doubled down on that, I guess. Yeah, and I think it just forces you to think about the other stuff, the gestures and the space, and maybe, Miriam, as you said, the theatrical aspect of it. It's just like, here's the script, and then the actors can think about how they want to fill in the backstory, and in that case, it's the reader. But I don't take it out. But as an editor, when I'm talking to other people, I often give that advice. It's just like, just don't say it. The part is usually the part that it's the writer telling themselves what the story is about. And that's the least interesting thing for the reader. And it's usually the worst writing. So you just take it out. Your work will not suffer for it. Just trust that the other stuff is there. And really think about the technical aspect instead of the emotional or psychological aspect. I think there's just too much overemphasis on psychological realism in contemporary fiction. I think it's boring. I don't care about it. But that's, that's a stylistic, that's just a aesthetic choice, I guess. You can make anything work. And of course, there's writers who do a great job of doing what I don't do.
That's a great way to put it. And like with your writing and what I aspire to write sometimes, because I'd say that your writing has been a bit of an influence on some of mine. I find it helpful to think of other mediums. Your writing is closer to like Caravaggio or like Artemisia Gentileschi. There's like a Tenebris or a chiaroscuro. Like there's shadows and we don't know what's in those shadows. And then you have, wonderful artists like realists in which everything is showing all the little details. It's very like full of light and clarity, just leaning into whatever your voice is and your style is great. So thanks. That's some good advice. I'm so often told like, you need to know what the character's favorite food is or what their childhood home looked like. No, often it's not.
It's so not important unless it's really important to them, or it's important to the moment that you're describing. You're just describing a part of someone's life usually, so just attend to that moment. It's okay. I mentioned Cormac McCarthy and been reading some of his stuff, and as a stylist, sometimes that man, he just goes beyond, right? It's like it's so maximalist in some ways that it's too much. Just like stop. Just fewer words, like close the dictionary, walk away from the dictionary. But he's a great example of somebody who uses a lot of words, but does not often really talk about the motivation for things, which makes his work really mysterious, even though there's so much writing in it, right? It's like so much language. You feel the effort of it so intensely, but it's really just describing things, how things look, but not necessarily how things feel. And it gives his work an incredible atmosphere, but with a lot of that mystery, a lot of that shadow. And I think, to me, that's really fascinating, that you can produce so much language and such a, almost too much language, so much specific words he uses. You have to have your big dictionary with you. And I notice a lot of his words that he uses are at either the top or the bottom of the page in my Oxford dictionary. And I think he really just read it. He really was just there. It's like, this one. But it's great. It reminds you of like, there's so many words to use, and we don't really use enough of them. For a long time, I didn't use a thesaurus. I was like, people use a thesaurus. You shouldn't have to like look for the word. But then it's like, no, sometimes you should, because it reminds you of the other words that exist that you could use. So I regret eschewing the thesaurus for so long. But yeah, the shadowiness, and the immediacy that we're talking about, it doesn't all come from the same style. And that's endlessly fascinating to me, that you can get to the same end in very different means. Yeah, like what a joy it is to read people that are like, they get to the same place, but they're just so wildly different in how they decide to use language and to exhibit their mastery over their control of it. I do think that people are afraid of the showing part of it. And it's okay, you can tell. Telling is great too. When I'm editing for other people, I'm always like, I can't see what is happening. Just show me what's happening. Like, somebody will say something really dramatic to someone else, and there's no description about how the other person received this information. And everyone tries to force it into dialogue or into the narrative describing, and then the person felt this. And it's like, yeah, but if you just have the right gesture, and it's that library of gestures that's so, to me, is undervalued and underused by writers. It's just like, really just think about the way that somebody touches their own face, their hair, their own body, the way that they soothe themselves in certain ways, the way that they see, what they notice about the way other people use their bodies. Like, there's so much information there. What backstory do you really need? In some ways. And again, you can use backstory to do the same thing that I'm talking about, but why not just try more? I think see more deeply into the scene. And once you let go of the obsession with knowing everything about what you're doing, you can focus on just seeing what you're doing, trying to see what you're doing as clearly as possible. And you'll get to the same type of, I think, rich feeling about your world that you're trying to create. But it's just a different kind of knowledge. It just comes from looking. I always thought if I could be any type of artist, it would be a painter. I love painting so much, and I love looking at paintings, and I think about how much you can get from a single image. Yeah, maybe we just need to look at more paintings. I don't know.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different ways to do it. Like you brought up Cormac McCarthy. I think I have some kind of painting reading synesthesia, because when I was reading his work, it was this kind of like thick oil painting that's similarly not as representational. Yeah. It's still obscure, and there's like a mysterious
and it's
shimmering.
So mythical. Yeah.
Oh, yes, absolutely. But you do have to read it with a dictionary. And then I gave up because some of his words weren't even in the dictionary. I needed like some kind of
you need the real
like
dictionary.
Rancher dictionary. Yeah, that's right. You need the original OED.
Sometimes I feel like he steers the boat and he tips it over. You just want to be like, dude, it's okay. You can push some of the words overboard and you'll be fine. I'll get the message. But I love that. I love seeing writers where, it's like it's almost too much at times, where you think, oh, it's just overboard. But there's something really great about that, too, as somebody who's willing to go there. And Nabokov, too. I mean, obviously, sometimes, does the rain really have to crepitate on the leaves? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a great word. Maybe it calls too much attention to itself, but writers like that remind you language itself and how it works, and that's the thing, right? That's the tool that you're using, and sometimes we work so hard to make it invisible. It's nice to read writing from writers who are like, no, this is the medium. The paint's going to go on really thick. But McCarthy's so great because his dialogue, I think, is, not everything. All the Pretty Horses is so annoying. And that was the first thing I read by him, and I hated it, and I didn't read him for many years because I thought it was all the same. But some of it's so good, and it's like, these are real people, and they're saying the right things, and his gestures are outstanding. He just describes the things that people do really, really well. Great master at that. I make it sound like I really like him. I don't. But I admire.
Plot twist,
I've been thinking about him recently and just appreciating him.
He did what he did very well.
He did, exactly. And, that says a lot because he created his own thing. talk about author photos. It's just like, I am a genius and I am laboring and all I care about is the life of the mind. Yeah.
Oh, definitely.
It's intimidating. You look at the pictures, you're like, I am not an artist. Get me out of the room with this guy, you know.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been super fun.
I'd say, where can our listeners find you? But I don't know if they can find you anywhere. So,
well, you know, my email's on my website. I do have a website. So the listeners, if they have a question, they can email me.
Perfect.
Yeah, which is much better than just looking at a bunch of posts I made about how beautiful my bookshelves are.